Hello, everyone. Welcome to Aptera Owners Club. Many of you have had a chance to watch the VLabs webinar with Aptera and Monroe and Associates and several other people talking about the state of EVs. And I wanted to give a recap on it because it's about an hour and 30 minutes long. So a lot of you guys probably didn't have the time to wade through it all. If you do have the time and you have the interest, I do recommend watching it. It was a fascinating conversation. They covered a lot of different topics, and it's probably worth the time to you can listen to it like while you're driving or something like that. Okay, but I just wanted to hit the highlights, and first of all, here's Sandy Monroe talking about liquidity.
What I'm seeing is a stumbling with lots and lots and lots of good ideas. Unfortunately, not a hell of a lot of money. And so consequently, I think money is the mother's milk of the industry. You can't survive without cash. So the big thing for me is we're watching the economy kind of falter. We're looking at interest rates that are headed for the moon. For me, the biggest stumbling block for some of the cars that I've been looking at, actually, and just not cars, VTOLs. There's all kinds of electric vehicles that are going to be coming into the marketplace. Money seems to be the big thing. So I'd like to start off asking, what does a company have to do in order to entice some cash, if you like, infusions. And what is that going to do to these companies? Is it going to kill them completely? Because that, I think, will kill off a lot of the industry. So I'd like to talk a little bit, or I'd like to hear a little bit about where the money is going to come from, how is it going to be distributed, what kind of interest rates are we going to see, and how are they going to pay it back? That
Okay, so we knew about this. Like I made a video about 5 months ago about the coming capital liquidity crisis, and capital has been become very hard to come by, especially for startups. And this was one of the venture capital firms telling their companies that they're backing that they need to cut costs because to avoid this death spiral. Um, so anyway, the capital markets are extremely challenging right now. They talked along about it. One of the panelists also mentioned how Tesla lost billions of dollars for a decade before they became profitable, but they were just able to raise capital for over a decade and keep themselves afloat through a combination of loans and investments and things like that. And somehow they made it. But other companies aren't going to have like a decade of grace period. They need to become profitable earlier. So that's a big challenge. They talked a lot about that at the beginning, and that was pretty interesting.
You have a lot, lighter weight vehicle, so you don't have, these brake parts that need servicing. Million-mile brake life. We have motors that are in our wheels and only have one wearable component, the axle bearing. It's a million-mile device.
Okay, so this is Chris talking about the advantages of having a light, efficient car. I think it's a little bit of hyperbole saying that's a million mile wheel bearings or a million mile brakes, but it's pretty clear that those are going to be long-lived parts and probably will last the life of the vehicle or very close to it. So seems like wheel bearing replacement is not a thing that most of us are going to have to worry about.
So we think, stepping into first principles engineering and then creating a really compelling solution is kind of the next step. I think it's something that Elon probably wanted to do from inception, but he kind of evolved into his company, and Tesla was up and going before he got there, and he just pushed. But I think if you asked Elon, hey, if you had to do it all over again, how would Tesla look? And I think he might say, well, it might look something like Aptera.
Well, here's the question for you guys. I mean,
That was a pretty bold statement by Chris that if Elon Musk had to do it again, he'd probably try to make Aptera. And Dave Lyons was the first engineer at Tesla. He got a kick out of it. So did Sandy. All right, this is talking about the supply chain issues.
Yeah, the supply chain has been a bit of a nightmare. We've had to pre-buy some of our microchips for the Aptera production for a whole year worth of production before we've even started production. We won't start production until next year. But there's some crazy lead times, 60 months on some chips.
That seems crazy. I've got to think that's an exaggeration. 60-month lead time. That's a 5-year lead time. That's insane. I don't know of anything that you'd want a 5-year lead time on. And if yeah, that seems excessive.
Which is, I think that will flush itself out over the next year, but people have to take precautions. It's also really yanked the price up on some of the base materials for electric vehicles. Rare earth materials, the things that go into our battery packs, just gone crazy. We don't have any domestic supply to kind of hedge that out, so we just have to shop the global markets to buy a lot of the things we need. Luckily, we've just signed an amazing deal in Europe to produce our carbon fiber body parts. We consider that kind of the future, of body structures. Steel and aluminum are built one way, but composites are just more fungible. They're much more easy to transport. You have petroleum refining, all around the world, so you can get the petroleum and kind of natural carbon fiber that you need to make these parts almost anywhere. We think that it really is the future of lightweight vehicles, which will just be a necessity for electric vehicles because the weight is just a huge penalty in your efficiency.
Yeah.
Chris, is
same
that a
thing.
risk though to you to have?
Sorry, go ahead, Dave.
Is that a risk to you, Chris, to have those key components made in Europe where you may struggle to get them back on shore?
So that's a great question, and I know a lot of you guys have asked that exact question in the comments.
It's a logistics, it's a challenge in logistics in the beginning, but the great thing about the Inflation Reduction Act and some of these plans that are coming out of the Department of Energy and others is we're going to onshore the production of those composite parts over time. So we're looking to domesticate that production, bring jobs back to America and make these beautiful lightweight structures right here in the States.
Okay, so it sounds like the plan is to make the eventually either make the composite structures themselves. I think that would take a ton of capital to get the presses and stuff, or contract with a U.S. Builder. Now, I don't know if there was a U.S. supplier available, why they didn't go to them initially. I kind of suspect there isn't a U.S. supplier. So when Chris Anthony is saying that, my guess is he's saying that eventually he's hoping that Aptera will become vertically integrated and make their own composite structures and become their own kind of foundry for the composite chassis. We know from previous interviews that the plan is to make the Elafe motors in the US. So either Elafe is going to build a factory in the US, or Aptera is going to build their own factory and license the technology from Aptera and build their own motors and become kind of vertically integrated that way. So that is the long-term plan here. All right, and I think this is the most interesting and kind of surprising but not surprising segment of the whole thing. And this is Chris Anthony talking about the timeline to production and funding issues.
But there's a lot of work for us to still do. We're about to pin our production design with Sandy's help, a very manufacturable design. But then we have to go through validation and ramping up our manufacturing facilities, getting all the equipment and tooling needed to do that. So unfortunately, the exact time of the first delivery is funding dependent. So Alexis, funding dependent. That if he could help us find those big dollars to buy that tooling and equipment, that would be great. But
That's how we kicked off this whole conversation. You got to get the money.
It's about 9 months for us, from the time we start deploying capital to when we start to deliver vehicles and ramp up our manufacturing line. So very.
All right. So he said that the time to production is funding dependent, and he's asking for help getting the funding from Alexi here. And then he says it's 9 months from the time they get to start deploying the funding. So they have to get the funding, then they have to deploy the funding, and then 9 months later is when production delivery starts. That's the way I interpreted it. And the way I hear this is that I suspect, before in the SEC filing, they said they needed $50 million to make it to production. They got $22 million in a grant through California. And I suspect through the crowdfunding round, they've made up the other 28. So I think they got the 50 million, but they've used up some of that at that point, and I think that the tooling costs for going to CPC to make the carbon fiber chassis, I think that the startup tooling costs for that are very expensive. And so initially they were going to do this honeycomb frame, but they're going to this carbon fiber, which I think they did because they realized that over the long term, that was going to be a more cost effective and a superior solution. But the initial startup cost is because they have to make these molds for it that are very expensive. It's going to be a lot more. They need the money to do the tooling. And it sounds like to me, they don't have the money yet. And once they get the money, then they have to do the tooling and get the supply chain, and then they start delivering 9 months after that. So this is my speculation, and I'm reading into a lot into what they're saying, but I think this tells us that we're more than 9 months away from production.
Quick in automotive terms, but you know, we still have a ways to go.
Okay, next one, Volker. I'm going to.
Okay, so that is those are the highlights. I think this last segment was the most interesting to us, and it is not not surprising. You know, we always knew, most of us knew that getting production early next year was probably unlikely. It sounds like they're just trying to get a Delta design done by the end of this year. I don't think we're going to see a physical Delta until sometime next year, and their production schedule is funding dependent, and I think they don't have the funding yet, and they need funding. And there was that one person that was planning on giving them funding next year, and I don't know if he plans on giving them funding after they've started production or before to help them get to production, but they need capital, and unfortunately, capital markets are really, really bad right now. So it's just unfortunate timing for us and for Aptera. So I hope they're able to find the funding, but it seems like it's pretty clear that we should not really expect production vehicles for at least 9 months, 9 months at the earliest from now. All right. Hopefully that's not too much of a disappointment. I think a lot of us were thinking that production really wasn't going to happen until mid or late next year anyway. So it's not too much of a surprise, but I think a lot of us were hoping that somehow they would do better than that. But I think it's just a very challenging solution. Okay, well, thanks for watching. Again, I would recommend you check out the entire webinar if you have the time. And thanks as always to our supporting members. Have a great day, everyone.